Good morning, everybody. This is Suzanne Walker. I am the Professional Development Office Supervisor from the Indiana State Library. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar. We are pleased to have Kit Malone here today. She is here to speak with us about best practices for serving LGBTQ, and she's from the ACLU. Welcome, Kit. I'm going to start off the webinar with a few announcements. This webinar is provided as part of the Library Trends and Hot Topics series. To register for other webinars available from this series or other webinars available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at library.in.gov under Services for Libraries. For a full list of our current in-person training menu, please see our continuing education website. The Indiana State Library has many ways that we try to stay connected to library staff across the state. For weekly updates on upcoming trainings and to learn more about what's happening in libraries across the state, please subscribe to our weekly e-newsletter, The Wednesday Word. We also offer a blog which provides information about the Indiana State Library collection, interview spotlights on library staff from across the state, and lots of information about upcoming events at the Indiana State Library. If you are having a sound issue during the webinar, please see the sound issues box just below the chat box. If there is a global sound issue, we will announce it in the chat box. If you are unable to resolve your sound issue, we are recording this meeting and you can certainly watch it offline after the meeting has ended. Again, if there is a global sound issue, we will make an announcement in the chat box. At this time, we are not experiencing any global sound issues. Hooray! So today's webinar will be archived and will be available to access and share on the Indiana State Library's Archive Trainings page. And I am just realizing that I forgot to get your LEU to download at the end of the webinar, so I will email those out probably tomorrow, and you'll get your LEU certificate for being here at the webinar tomorrow in your email. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kit, and we will get started.
Hi, everybody. This is Kit. I'm talking into this mic, and I feel like I'm going to hear you all back, although I know you're in there in the chat box. So feel free. I've thought a little bit about how we should do this. A lot of the times, these conversations really do become conversations. So if you have questions, do feel free to pop in. Depending on the volume or the complexity of the questions, we might save those for a little bit later. If it's something just like for a clarification, I'm sure that we'll try to get those in as easily as possible. So my name is Kit Malone. I'm a transgender advocate with the ACLU of Indiana. What I do is drive all over the state in my little red truck, finding people who are doing grassroots activism all throughout the state, and I teach them how to do education and community organizing and how to do things like this. So it's a really great job. I really feel lucky to have it, and I'm really looking forward to a really productive conversation with all of you. So let's just jump right into it. The way I formatted this slideshow, a lot of the times these slideshows are extremely boring. They focus on terminology, they focus on rules and do's and don'ts, and there are some do's and don'ts, and we're going to cover those. But I like to format this in terms of simple statements. So you'll see that this slide is transgender people are people, right? Most people are going to agree with that. I don't think we're going to find a lot of people who are just going to say that they don't think trans people are people. But what I'm trying to do here is format these in statements that are positive, that shows you how these are really just common sense ideas that just require us to think a little bit about what sort of the implications of some of our attitudes might be when we sort of map them out in this way with simple statements. So again, trans people are people. We have some ideas, I think, in our head culturally about what trans people look like, but really we come in all ages, shapes, colors, and sizes. We come from everywhere in the world. There isn't one type of trans person. Our individuality is just like everyone else's. I think we all have respect for individuality. I know that in American culture, we think a lot about individuality, and trans people are really no different. Trans people are just like you, and that's a simplistic statement, right? Nobody is just like anybody else. The thing that makes them different from the average, we all have things that make us different from the average, and the thing that makes trans people different is that the doctor wrote the wrong gender on their birth certificate when they were born. That's what makes them transgender. People with that correct assignment, people where the doctor looks down at the genitals of the baby and makes a determination and writes down a gender on the birth certificate, which is how we do it now, those people are called cisgender. So that's most people. For a small proportion of people, that determination is going to be incorrect. That is because as a culture, we assume that parts equals gender. But we know from a lot of evidence and from experience with cultures in the past that parts are not the same thing as gender. So people with in our culture, people whose gender is not what is marked on their birth certificate originally, we call those people transgender. We're not defined by parts. You know, we have this culture that sort of believes that our parts determine our gender. In reality, and this is backed up by science, everyone has an inborn gender identity that may or may not line up with sort of our conventional ideas about physical body parts. Transgender men are men, right? Transgender women are women. Now, this sounds like a really simplistic statement, but a confusion about this really gets to the heart of some of the confusions that people have about transgender identity. For me, transgender is just a description, like I'm blonde or I'm left-handed. I'm not Canadian, actually, but those are just adjectives. Transgender is just an adjective. Sometimes it's relevant. For instance, in this discussion, it's relevant to talk about the fact that I am a transgender woman. It's not necessarily the only thing of interest about me. Another thing that is often ignored is that transgender people can be everyone in between man and woman. Some transgender people don't fit neatly into those binary categories like man or woman. These people, we call them non-binary. Some people we call gender non-conforming. Gender non-conforming people tend to be people who are cisgender, who don't have any connection to what we would consider typical gendered roles. You might think of someone who is assigned as a woman, but who is very butch in her presentation, but still considers herself a woman, as someone who's a little gender non-conforming. And some people choose to identify that way to express their sort of dislike of those roles. Non-binary trans people, confusingly, can seem very similar, but they are people who actually experience no particular gender identity, or maybe sometimes one or two gender identities that switch between the two. So transgender people are real.
Well, that seems like a simple statement.
Right, I exist. But being transgender is not a delusion, and I think it is commonly considered in popular culture to be a delusion. This is not a mental disease that can be cured by therapy. This is something we've seen over and over. We have a lot of evidence that attempts to quote unquote cure transgender people can actually be very damaging, and most legitimate medical organizations consider that abuse. Most of the organizations that do things like conversion therapy are listed by the Southern Poverty Law Center as hate groups. Current science joins every legitimate medical organization in the world to support the reality of the transgender experience. So one thing that I often do to respond to people who are like, well, how do you know this isn't all in your head? I say, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a neuroscientist, but here's a list that includes the World Health Organization that explains that this is a real thing, and we have lots of historical evidence to back it up. So here's where we're going to get into a little bit about language. I want to talk a little bit about language. This is going to help you when you work with your transgender coworkers. This is going to help you when you work with your transgender patrons. There are some niceties to observe. I happen to think these things are intuitive, but I also think that C++ programming language is intuitive, so who am I to know?
I don't think that's intuitive.
So transgender people definitely deserve respectful language. If a person tells you they are a woman, you should refer to them as one conversationally, and the same for men. Sometimes this may not be obvious. One thing that I do, and I am in situations where I am not always sure of the gender of the person that I'm talking to. My strategy is to try to use neutral words or their name until they choose to sort of disclose their needs to me. And that usually happens organically, and it usually happens pretty quickly, believe it or not. I think a lot of people, when they don't know, are you a man or a woman, they go into this panic, and they have to find out that information. And we don't do a lot of thinking about whether or not we need that information, whether or not that information is something that is actually relevant to any conversation we're about to have. And we sort of get hung up on that. I find that if I just sort of hang back, learn their name, have a natural, normal conversation, that is something that often comes out. If there is a need to know the gender of someone you're speaking to, another strategy that you can use is to do what is common in transgender circles, which is to introduce yourself with your pronouns. So I often introduce myself as, "Hi, I'm Kit Malone. My pronouns are she and hers. What are yours?" That's non-threatening in a lot of situations, because what you're saying to that person is, I am someone who understands this. You're offering them your pronouns, so you're making that first step. That is still complicated, and I want to caution you that that's still complicated. You definitely don't want to make someone feel like it's obvious that they're trans, right? But in some situations where you're sort of trapped and need to know, that's kind of one way that you can get it across that's a little bit safer than just walking up to someone saying, "Hey, are you trans? You look kind of trans."
So can I just ask a clarifying question? I suppose and I think it's basically kind of what you just said, which is, like, could people be offended if you ask them, if you say, "Hi, I'm Suzanne. My pronouns are she and her. What are yours?"
Yeah.
I mean, some people might take that, and be insulted or be offended or something like that.
I think that is can be a danger. I would also
And I think
say
that's what
that
you just said, like
that
cautioning.
literally never happened to me.
Okay.
My experience has been that trans people feel much safer and happier when they know that they're in the presence of someone who is educated enough to sort of know those conversational niceties.
Right.
The danger that I see with that, and again, dealing with minorities who live under threat of violence, get used to the rules sometimes being difficult to understand. But one thing that I would say is that you should be aware of the surroundings. I would definitely never walk up to someone in a crowded restaurant and say, "Hey, what are your pronouns?"
Right.
Because I could be outing that person in front of all manner of people. Yeah. I've certainly been outed in crowded places in ways that were extremely threatening and frightening. But I, for instance, encourage, when I do trainings for businesses, I encourage business meetings, people who lead business meetings, to begin using pronoun introductions as just a part for the course. I put my pronouns in my email signature.
I saw they're on your first slide.
Yeah. I think that when we normalize those interactions, we're saying to the trans people in our midst, and remember, you may not know you work right next to a trans person. We're saying to that person, you're safe. Like, we're saying to that person, we understand that you have a need here.
Thanks.
No problem. So, warning as before I move on, next slide contains a potentially offensive slur. I always like to warn people of that before I assault you with it. So we're going to talk about, this is the one real section where I'm going to talk a little bit about terms, and here we go. We're going to make it fast and painless. Transgender is not a noun or a verb. You are not a transgender, and you were never transgendered. There was no moment that someone hit me on the head with the transgender stick and I became transgendered. Calling a trans person or a transgender person transgendered is a little bit like using the term colored. It's something that we don't do because it implies that it was something that was done to you. Trans woman with no space or trans man with no space are incorrect, and so is transgendered. Again, we go back to the fact that transgender is only ever an adjective. You would never call me a blonde woman with no space, right?
Right.
Again, transgender is just a descriptor. It is not a defining element of who I am. It's just part of who I am. Trans is an acceptable abbreviation of transgender. You may have heard words like transsexual, transvestite, and crossdresser. I even tripped over it myself.
Right.
Those words are deeply insulting to many trans people. There are some trans people, particularly older trans people, because terminology has changed, who are completely comfortable using terms like this. And again, as someone who is cisgender, if you are, under no circumstances should you take it upon yourself to tell them what words they can use. I certainly don't tell my elders what words they can use to describe themselves. They've been through so much more than I have. But if you want to avoid offense, transgender is the safest word that you can use. I would avoid transsexual or transvestite or crossdresser, which really is a completely different phenomenon, but unfortunately a lot of people don't seem to know the difference. Tranny is a deeply offensive slur. It is the trans equivalent of the N-word. Do not use it to describe trans people.
When you were saying that, I was thinking, if someone referred to me as a blonde, I would be offended.
Right.
Right,
absolutely.
But if they said, oh, she's a blonde woman,
Yeah.
like, oh, that makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, it makes it person-centered. Your
Exactly.
personhood is still acknowledged in that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If I am often referred to as a transgender, and it gets me every single time.
Yeah, because it seems to take it away from you and sort of objectifies you even.
Yeah, and I think that's how most trans people feel about it. All right, we're going to talk about sex. Everyone loves this. We're going to talk about sex in the most boring way, though. We are going to talk about sexual orientation because I find that among cisgender people, this is something that people get hung up on. It is important to recognize that despite being the T in the LGBT, being trans isn't a sexual orientation. We are, trans is not how we're oriented. It is part of our gender. And those two things are different. So there are straight, gay, and bisexual trans people. Trans women who are attracted to men are straight because trans women are women. Trans men attracted to men are gay because trans men are men. If you just remember, and this is the simple way, if you remember that trans women are women and trans men are men, then it becomes much easier to understand that. I know that that is a point of confusion. It's something that I always try to kind of clear up. I think a lot of trans women particularly are a little used to people presuming that they're just gay men who got extremely feminine. Like that's sort of the myth. And it's definitely not related, and I can tell you that from experience. So, we're safe to pee with. I would never have, oh my lord, I would never have predicted that at the age of 42 years old in 2017 that I would be spending at least 60% of my professional life explaining to people that I am safe to enter a bathroom. But that's where we are today. It is important to say this really clearly. Trans people pose no danger to anyone in bathrooms. We have cities all over the country that have for decades. We have ordinances protecting gender identity that go back beyond 15 years in this country. No reported crimes. Officials in those municipalities do not report any uptick in assaults committed in bathrooms. There's simply no, we have years of history with us and no basis for presuming that allowing trans people to use the correct bathroom is going to put anyone in danger. The evidence is really in on this. However, trans people themselves are incredibly likely to experience harassment and violence when forced to use the wrong bathroom, something that I can also personally attest to, as can many trans women. So we have real health needs, and this is a sensitive topic. I want to convey that this is a safe space. If you have questions that you want to ask, this is a place, as long as they're not too personal. A lot of trans people are a little leery talking about their experience with the sorts of health care that sort of floats around under the term transitioning. We're generally used to feeling a little medicalized, but people are curious. It's important to know that your curiosity should never allow you to ask like deeply personal questions about the genitalia of people you work alongside or work for.
Right, that's always inappropriate.
Right, always inappropriate, but you would be surprised at the number of people who do not know that that's inappropriate.
I would not be surprised.
And I think that part of that is that there is there's a circus mentality. Like if they feel like you are a novelty, and therefore the social rules that we would normally ask of anybody, like they just are off at a certain point. So medical needs that trans people have can include things like hair removal, hormone therapy, certain kinds of surgery, many kinds of surgery. Every transition is unique. This care and all of the things that fall under it can be called transitioning, or we can call it affirming care. We never ever call it a sex change operation. The thing that I always found hysterical about the sex change operation is it implies that you hopped on a plane to Thailand and had like a 3-day spa trip and came back, looking perfect. That's not how this works. It ignores the fact that most trans people are incredibly poor. We don't have access to the kinds of healthcare that it takes. People look at celebrities who have had such wonderful experiences and assume that that's the experience of most of us. Many trans people will never be able to afford any medical intervention. And many will choose not to have any medical intervention. Having any kind of surgery or anything like that is not what being trans is, and being trans is not dependent on anything like that. Again, we call this affirming care, and the necessity of affirming care is something that, again, is supported by every major medical organization on the planet, despite the fact that we still have trouble getting insurance to provide it for us. Some basic rules. And this is something, when I get to this slide, whenever I'm in the presence of an audience, I always see the women nodding. All of the cis women are like, yeah, I get this. Transgender people don't belong to you. So don't expect that the trans people that you meet or that you work with, that you work alongside, that you serve as customers to educate you about trans issues. Don't expect trans people that you meet to answer personal questions. So much of the time in my life, I will have people walk up to me and say, I have a trans daughter, and I just want you to know that I'm the most accepting person in the world, and I'm sure that they are. But I sometimes think that people don't understand what a burden that can be for people, to always feel like you're their walking example of a trans person. So, avoid sharing your stories about how great you are with us. Respect us as humans first, and we'll be happy to have really lovely friendships with you. But they should be based not on the fact that you think it's cool that we're trans. You should not expect trans people that you meet to allow you to touch their bodies without permission. This was a thing, just to say personally, that surprised me when it started happening. As I went on in years through my transition, people started grabbing me a lot in a way that I was absolutely unused to when people perceived me as a man. I was absolutely unused to people grabbing my shoulders and moving me aside, invading my personal space. I have a tattoo on my arm. People would start to grab my arm to look at my tattoo just out of nowhere. A lot of us are very scared in public about violence, and this can be very activating and could lead to some really bad, unfortunate circumstances, depending on who gets grabbed. Aren't sex objects. Lots and lots of people get their understanding of transgender people from pornography and the sex industry. These stereotypes harm transgender people. And by the way, politically, personally, I support sex workers' rights. I don't think there's anything demeaning about sex work, but it is absolutely demeaning to presume that that is what defines us and what we are. Trans people are real humans. We aren't defined by sex any more than other people. In fact, in my experience, a lot of us are defined by sex a lot less than other people. And that is, it's unfortunate that people get their images of us from really cheap pornography sites that do not at all accurately represent who we are. And this results in violence. There are phenomenons of people who are cisgender seeking out transgender people, and they're fueled by these overly sexed ideas that they've gotten off the internet. And they're usually abusive people who are often prone to commit violence against the sort of trans people that they inadvertently pick up in bars. This is a thing that happens. So remember that you may not know what we're like, and you may not recognize us in public. Most of us have boring jobs like at the ACLU. So back to We Are People. Get to know trans people as a whole human being first. If you're lucky enough to work next to a trans person, if you are lucky enough to have a friend who comes out or transitions, learn to see those people as individuals, have those authentic relationships with them. You're gonna be, in the end, you're gonna learn a lot more that way. You're going to, I know that cisgender people have questions and interests and want to know, and I get that, I think that curiosity is a natural and human thing. I have to say that, like, there's not just one kind of trans person. You know, I didn't know very much about trans men until I started dating one. And the way that I have grown to understand their experiences is by getting to know my boyfriend as a person. And I think that that's a one way that you can have. And by that, you'll also be enriching the life of a trans person, because a lot of us feel very isolated. So having those authentic friendships that aren't based on who we are, you know, what our identity is, can be really valuable. I think that maybe we should take a break and take some questions. I feel like this has been a bit long.
Yeah, we're good.
All right.
Does anyone have any questions right now for Kit? If you do, go ahead and feel free to put them in the chat box. Any questions?
I have one last note before you go. If we don't have questions, one thing I also want to say, and I'm going to skip ahead. I brought a lot more than I needed to get through, but I want to get through here, this last slide. One thing I always want to point out when I do this, I often feel like people, when I do a lot of training at organizations and businesses, and one conflict that I feel is that I've done that training and that people will go home and say, well, I had the slideshow. Now I know how to do this. You know, particularly I've trained police officers. I've worked with IMPD, and they're wonderful people who welcomed me in. But I worry that someday some poor trans person is going to have a problem, and the officer that they're involved with is going to say, well, I watched this 20-minute slideshow and I know how to be a good ally. And just know that this short training doesn't make you an expert on trans people. Definitely don't use what you've learned here when speaking to a trans person to tell them that they're wrong about something.
Right.
Definitely, we are the people who can relate our experiences the best. You're all, with any minority, with any minority group, your best option is to just sit and listen.
Okay, so we do have a couple questions. We'll get to those here in just a second. I just want to let everybody know here that in just a second, Kit and I are actually going to trade places, and I'm going to share with you a few other resources that are available to you guys. So the question that came in the chat box is, can you define gender fluid?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay. So gender fluid is what we call one of the non-binary gender identities. Gender fluid people typically report that they feel, rather than being between man or woman or neither man or woman, they are people who might move back and forth in their feelings about whether or not they are male or female, depending on the day or depending on the circumstance. And they might choose to express that by changing their mode of clothing or they're changing their presentation as a person, or they might not choose to express it at all, and it's just something that's internal. Does that answer the question?
We'll see what she says. We might have one. Yes, that answers the
Awesome.
question. We might have one other question coming in. I'm going to go ahead. Kit and I are going to trade spots here and have her check the chat, and we'll be right back. Kit gave a beautiful answer to your question, Cheryl, and we are going to give it again. So I apologize. Okay, Kit, you get to talk again.
So yeah, Cheryl, just to confirm, you didn't hear my answer, right?
No, I'm sure she didn't.
Correct.
Right, okay.
All right. So just to take it back, so when you're asking me, like, when I said that I never had a bad reaction, I'm not introducing myself as transgender when I do that. When I say my pronouns are she and her, I'm introducing myself as a woman. Now, I agree that the fact that I am visibly transgender may change that interaction when I'm talking to someone else who might be trans. But what I will say is that I know from experience from sort of the conversations that we have as a community with the people in my life, and so much of what I consider my family are trans people. I know that I don't know someone who would be offended by that if it was in an appropriate setting. Now, there are inappropriate settings like restaurants or like public places where there's not a reason for us to care, but there are times, particularly I think formal settings like business meetings when we're introducing one another, where it's completely appropriate, and I don't know many trans people who would be offended by it.
So I think the key to that is it an appropriate situation?
Yeah.
Right. And like you're saying, more formal situations might be better.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to avoid at all times sort of outing people. That's the big danger. You want to make sure you're never outing someone, because outing has repercussions, violence particularly.
Right. Okay, thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for being patient. This is the mistake that I make on webinars all the time, is I forget to turn that microphone back. I forget to connect it again. So anyway, thank you so much, Kit. So the next few slides I'm going to share with you guys are some resources that you might be able to use when working with these populations. So the first place that I want to mention is the American Library Association. They do have a gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender roundtable that discusses the best practices for service to these populations. I'm going to go ahead and show you the roundtable website quickly. This is actually the toolkit that they've put together, and I will share this out when I send you your LEUs. And I read through this, and it's really a great little primer on all sorts of things. I'll show you some of the topics that they talk about. Have you ever looked at this kit?
Yeah.
Okay. So the kit is really designed to help library staff, as you can see, understand the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender library users, how best to serve their needs, how to manage challenges. So that's, you can read the introduction to see. But a lot of this is going to reflect the things that Kit has already said, particularly about transgender people. And then some other things, they do give you a couple of resources for working with terminology.
That GLAAD Media reference guide is great.
Okay, good.
It's actually something I give out to people all the time. It's a wonderful guide.
Great, thank you. So that's clearly a good guide for you guys to take a look at. They also have a lot of practical tips in here for you guys to take a look at. They've got information here on outreach and partnering, different kinds of programming that you might do. We are in June, which is GBLT Book Month. So if you have any book clubs going on, you could certainly do, a title that might work with that. There are specific things here for academic libraries, public libraries, and school libraries. And I think these are particularly great because there are different needs in all three of those areas, particularly with school libraries, because a lot of times, kids are just figuring things out, and in some cases they have lots of challenges in there. And so I know when I was first a teen librarian, it was really important to me to get involved with our GSA and things like that at the high school that I worked near. There is also recommended reading. And the thing I really wanted to kind of highlight from the library perspective is about collections and collection development. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys are aware that collection development can be a great place for libraries to support these communities. You want to be sure that that your collection reflects the diversity in your community. It should include materials for all these populations. There are lots of book awards out there that can help you get a core collection started if you don't have one in your library yet. The Stonewall Book Awards are really great. There's a rainbow book list that you can take a look at. But then the other part I want to show you here is actually about cataloging and labeling. And this is really the thing that I want to focus on a little bit today. So this really goes to what Kit was saying about different terminology. There's terminology out there that is not used any longer. So if you have anything in your library that's got, is cataloged as like sex change material, you want to recatalog that to have something more appropriate. And that might be something that we haven't thought about. Our subject headings, are those appropriate for what we've got? Are they appropriate for 2017? Along with your nonfiction collections in general, you want to go ahead and review those to see, do you have all the books that are for these specific populations in one place? Or are they interfiled? Because they should be interfiled. You shouldn't put them all together because that can really isolate people. They can feel like, oh, I'm not normal, and so you've got me all in one spot. And then also, I love what they say here about labeling. ALA really does caution you against labeling books as a rainbow book or a GBLT book because when you're putting them all in one place, people might feel that they are not comfortable going to that area of the shelf. Maybe they'll feel like people are going to assume that they're gay or that they're a lesbian or other kinds of assumptions. Kit is nodding here a lot. I'm just going to give you a chance to make any comments that you might, because I know you haven't seen this before.
Oh no, I think that's
what do you think?
That's great advice.
Yeah.
I think that sort of structuring systems so that you have like one place to go certainly will make people who are afraid
not want to go there.
Not want to go there because
Yeah.
if they're seen, like what if they run it, especially in a small town library, if you walk in, I did a guide for Freedom Indiana, which is an organization I used to work for, on voting rights, and it's the same situation in small towns particularly. People may be afraid to go out in public, to go to places where they may be seen by their fellow citizens because that may result in real actual harassment for them later on.
Right, and Jan is coming in and saying that that's so true. So, and then there's also more in this toolkit about challenges to your collections, which could happen, and of course, as ALA and as librarians, we of course don't support censorship, but you might get challenges to your collection, and there's information there. There's also information here about GBLT library staff, which we sort of addressed a little bit today. So I just wanted to share that with you guys. That's a really great quick toolkit that you could look at. This would be great required reading for staff, I think. So let's see here. Cheryl has a question. What's your opinion on developing displays highlighting materials? I think that's a great idea. I'm going to cover that here in just a second. So that was the ALA one. The next tool I want to show you about is from Library Anchor Models for Bridging Diversity Achievements. And the acronym is Lambda, but this is not the same as Lambda Legal. So that's a separate organization which also does cover a lot of LGBTQ stuff. Okay, so I'm going to show you this toolkit, if it will let me go there.
We have another question.
Okay.
How do you respond when your display gets challenged?
Oh, wow. Hi, Monica.
As a non-library person,
Yeah.
but as an ACLU person, I have opinions about that, obviously.
Do you want to go ahead and share with us what you might think on that?
Well, I don't know what best practices for libraries are, but obviously the ACLU is a fairly firm
Oh my gosh,
First Amendment organization.
Yes, absolutely.
That's horrible to see that your display was challenged by, I presume, a community member. Oh, goodness.
What?
Well,
Monica.
Monica, I am not a lawyer, but what I would tell you is that it would not be a bad idea to visit the ACLU of Indiana's website or find someone who was Oh, is this a patron that did this? Yes. Um, I think that as a non-librarian, I don't know how to tell you how to respond to that. Um, but goodness, like I feel you. I've been, in my work, do a lot of work in small towns trying to pass human rights ordinances, and I've had to like stand with people who are being very hateful and putting a lot of pressure on me to get out of town. I think that the only thing you can do as a one of our institutions of free speech, one of our institutions of free thought is the public library.
Yes.
Is to stand your ground
Yes,
on that.
and Monica, I know that it is a challenge, and I know that it's hard. ALA certainly is there to help with those kinds of things. I really think the best thing is to leave it up. You could also present them. I don't know if you keep a schedule of the displays that you do, but if you can provide them with a schedule of like, in February we talk about African American history. In June we're talking about GBLTQ populations. During this day is when we talk about world religions. If you can provide them some context to show that, the display is going to be up for a certain amount of time and then it's going to go down and we're going to put something else up, just showing them the broader context where that lives, I think is good. And Brenda makes a great point that it's important to have good policies and procedures. Monica, I'm not sure which library you're talking about because I know that you're in a area where you're transitioning jobs, so I'm not sure.
I will say though that if you have
because Monica might be the director actually, but go ahead.
If you are in if you're in a location that you feel like you might benefit from, for instance, some public education, I would say that that's something that I do.
Yeah.
And in fact, the program that I run in Indiana, one of the things that we do is work with people in smaller towns and rural parts of the state to do education events and outreach events. So, oh, awesome. That's great to hear. But feel free. I will make sure that my contact information is made available to people. I really appreciate that you did that, and anything that else that we can do to support any community that's interested in sort of pushing the needle on this, because it's true, as a library, when you are tackling these issues in many areas, you're definitely sort of pushing the needle on public opinion. You're right there on the knife's edge, which is one of the things that I love about the libraries and one of the things that I love about free speech. But I also understand that we can have sort of a that can draw you fire professionally and make it hard in the community. So anything that the ACLU can do to aid that, please let me know.
Right. Okay. So again, that's a challenging situation. I'm sorry, Monica. Okay, so a couple other things just to share with you guys. This is another really good toolkit. It's a little bit more targeted and a little longer than the first one I showed you. The first one I just really love, and I think you could easily make it be required reading for staff. This one is a little bit more about teens in particular, and it's about working with homeless LGBTQ folks because, this is something that unfortunately these populations experience to a greater degree than cis populations would.
Can I
absolutely
can I interject here? Of the LGBTQ youth who are homeless, 61, I think it's over 60% of those LGBTQ homeless youth are trans or trans identifying.
So it's particularly prevalent in that population. So this toolkit just provides a lot of background. It provides some terms, all kinds of things. So I just want you guys to know that it exists, and it's another resource out there for you guys. I was hoping it had a good table of contents, but it doesn't quite have one that I can just put on the slide right now. So I'm just going to keep scrolling. I guess I'll just stop right here because this is really a good kind of, I don't know, closing for this whole presentation anyway. So what do young people need from your library? What do people need from your library? What do trans people need from your library? All the people that are using your library need books. They need access to books, other printed material. They need CDs. They need DVDs. They need other form of entertainment. That's the same as any patron, you know? So a lot of times when I'm doing presentations like this, I just like to remind my librarians, be a good library. Serve all of your patrons, you know, as equally as you possibly can. But I will go ahead and mention this one point on the slide, which is about the internet. The internet is extremely critical for homeless people in general, and you might, you know, feel like, well, what could they have to do with the internet for? Well, it's not like these people fall out of the sky, you know, like they have families, they have friends, they have people they want to stay in touch with, they need to get access possibly to medical care, possibly to housing or school or employment, lots of other things. And so it is particularly important to try to keep internet access open as much as possible in your libraries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And could I just
absolutely
touch in on that? The internet is definitely a lifeline for these kids. I know that regularly, I would say 5 or 6 times a year, I use my social media network to find a place to sleep for a kid that's been kicked out. Like that is a regular occurrence. And without access to the internet, without access to that, which many of them lose access because they'll be in communities where they can't easily get to a library, those kids will often just fall right through the cracks because nobody will be able to get out any kind of word, even for just a couch to sleep on. Mm-hmm. So having access to the internet is so vital.
Right. So I know that Monica had questions about displays, so I'm going to kind of run to that area of my presentation quickly. I will just mention that, you know, as with all of our collections, they do need to reflect your community. GLBTQ folks like to read about people like themselves, just like kids and other minorities, just like anyone does. So again, I'm going to sort of flip through some of this. That's not all. I've got more. These are lots of books, and this is on our slide share, and I will send a link to you to all of this. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get through this so we can get to the display area, and then we'll finish up. Okay, so these are some examples of displays that, you know, are out there or have happened, and this one in Brown County is one that I actually saw, and that's Brown County, Indiana, you know, and so that's a small rural community as well, and they had one on LGBTQ history in particular, which I think is interesting. You know, here are a few others that have been done, and again, I do think that policies and procedures are really important because just like we have policies and procedures for our meeting rooms, you know, we're going to let this group use our meeting room and we're going to let this group use our meeting room. We need to have policies to back ourselves up. And if you are having a challenge to a display, I think that policy or procedure can really help you defend the fact that you've decided to put something up. You can always do them for June is a you know, good easy time to do it. It makes sense. It's nationally, you know, Pride Month and things like that. So mostly I just wanted to flip through those quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and put just this slide up as we close out here. So some quick programs that you could do to kind of get more involved in these community organizations in your populations. I really think partnering with your Gay Straight Alliance at your high school is a great place to start. Find out if they have one, find out what kind of programs they have, really reach out and let them know that you would welcome them at the library. When I first got started working with some, you know, great, awesome teens at my library in Mooresville, it was because their GSA wasn't able to meet anywhere, and so they needed a place, and so we offered the library, and you know, now they can meet at their school, and that's great. You know, inviting them to the library, inviting them to participate in your teen council if you are you know, a teen librarian is great, and really just being a welcoming organization like we all are would be wonderful. GSA is a Gay Straight Alliance, and this is a group that many high schools have. There's actually, let me see if nope, I don't have it. There's a organization called, is it Indiana Youth Group?
Indiana Youth Group,
Indiana Youth Group, and I want to say that they have a place on their website where they keep track of all of the GSAs and all the high schools in Indiana.
Actually,
Kit's gonna correct me.
Good friends. No, you're absolutely correct. Okay. I'm good friends with Lane Bannister, who is the statewide coordinator for all of the GSAs. And if people want information on how to get one of those going or how to support your local, I know that my email address is going to be sent out eventually. So feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to connect you with the statewide coordinator for the GSA.
And I'm writing a note about that. Okay.
And also, Indiana Youth Group's just a wonderful organization that everyone should know about.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I don't think I've got Kit's email handy. Let me see if I can get to it.
Do you want me to just type it in here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead and put it in the chat box.
I'm going to type this into the chat box now.
That would be great. So thank you guys again so much, and I apologize for not having your LAU certificate. I will email those out to you hopefully today or tomorrow. I'll get that out right away. So Kit's email is there in the chat. If you have any questions, follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. She's graciously said that she'd take all of our questions, so that's fantastic. Yeah. And I want to thank Kit for being here today and all of you for the wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys.